Picture this, you're on stage with the Beatles, still early days, and it's your moment, the spotlight guitar solo, the part where everyone's watching just you, and your fingers simply stop working. Not a wrong note, not a stumble, a complete freeze, in front of a live audience, with nowhere to hide. That actually happened to Paul McCartney, and by his own account, it nearly ended his entire career before it really started. Today I'm going deep into a side of Paul McCartney most fans never picture, the stage fright that almost drove him to quit performing entirely, the surprising reason he ended up as the band's bassist instead of its lead guitarist, a hidden regret buried inside Yesterday that only recently came to light, and the quiet reconciliation with John Lennon that McCartney has called the most important closure of his life. Stick around, because there's a lot more vulnerability behind this legendary career than most people realize. This story comes from McCartney himself, shared on his own podcast, McCartney, A Life in Lyrics. And it centers on a moment from early in the Beatles' history, long before Paul McCartney became known as one of the greatest bass players in rock history. Back then, McCartney was actually the group's lead guitarist, with John Lennon handling rhythm guitar. During one performance, McCartney's moment came, a spotlight solo, the part of the show where the band steps back and the crowd's attention locks in on one player. And in that moment, his fingers completely locked up in panic. Not a minor stumble he could play through. A total freeze, in the middle of a live performance, in front of an audience that was watching specifically for that solo. If you've ever had a moment of pure stage fright, public speaking, a job interview, anything where your body just stops cooperating with what your brain is telling it to do, you have some sense of what that must have felt like. Now imagine it happening on a stage, in a band, with everyone watching, and no way to quietly step back and regroup. What's striking about how McCartney describes the aftermath isn't just embarrassment, it's how close it came to actually ending things. He said that he was mortified by the blunder, and that in the moment afterward, he told himself he would never put himself through that again. Not, I need more practice. Not, I'll get better with time. A much heavier conclusion, that he simply lacked the talent to perform live at all. Think about how significant that is, given everything that came after. This is a man who would go on to spend decades as one of the most confident, charismatic live performers in music history, playing to massive stadiums well into his 80s. And at one specific early moment, he genuinely believed he wasn't cut out for the musician's life at all, based on a single frozen solo. It's a reminder that even people who eventually become legends in their field often go through moments of real, crushing self-doubt early on. Moments that, if things had gone slightly differently, might have changed the entire trajectory of their career, and by extension, music history itself. Here's where the story takes a turn that actually explains something fans have wondered about for decades. Why did Paul McCartney end up playing bass and not lead guitar for the Beatles? Instead of giving up on performing entirely, that frozen, panicked moment caused a real, permanent shift in the band's internal dynamic. Rather than continuing to force himself into the lead guitarist spotlight role that had triggered that panic, McCartney pivoted, he started mastering other instruments, and eventually stepped into what would become his legendary role as the band's bassist. That's a fascinating reframe of Beatles history. The role most closely associated with Paul McCartney, when one of the most influential bass players of all time, someone whose melodic, inventive bass lines helped define an entire genre of music, that of the moment of genuine failure and fear on lead guitar. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it flips the usual narrative around natural talent. McCartney didn't become the bassist because it was always obviously his calling from day one. He became the bassist in part because a different instrument had triggered a paralyzing moment of stage fright, and he needed somewhere else to put his musical energy. Sometimes the thing someone becomes most famous for isn't their first choice, it's what's left after their first choice didn't work out the way they hoped. McCartney has continued opening up about deeply personal moments from his past, particularly while discussing the emotional themes running through his 2026 album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane. And one of the more surprising revelations involves one of the most famous songs ever written, Yesterday, released back in 1965. McCartney recently admitted that the lyrics to that song were subconsciously influenced by an old argument with his mother. He's described a specific teenage memory, queso, a moment where he teased his mother for pronouncing a word in what he considered a posh way, a small, seemingly forgettable moment between a teenager and his mom. Except it didn't stay forgettable. After her passing, that small memory left him with an enduring sense of guilt, the kind of guilt that lingers precisely because you can never actually go back and apologize, or explain that you didn't mean anything cruel by it. And according to McCartney, that lingering guilt subconsciously worked its way into the lyrics of Yesterday, one of the most covered, most beloved songs in the history of popular music, a song largely interpreted as being about lost love and looking back with longing. Knowing that detail changes how you might hear the song. What's often been read as a song about romantic loss may actually be carrying, underneath it, a much more specific and personal thread, a son's quiet, decades-long guilt over one small teenage moment with his mother that he never got the chance to make right. There's another piece of McCartney's emotional history worth including here because it connects directly to how he talks about closure and unfinished business. The Beatles' breakup was, famously, not a clean or friendly one. In the final days of the band, John Lennon made a number of hurtful public remarks about McCartney, comments that played out publicly, adding real pain to an already difficult professional and personal split. But McCartney has talked, in retrospectives on his life after the band, about how their eventual personal reconciliation before Lennon's tragic death remains the most important closure of his entire life. Not the biggest commercial success, not any specific song or album. The fact that he and Lennon found their way back to some kind of peace with each other before Lennon was killed in 1980, that's a meaningful thing to hear from someone who has had about as full and celebrated a career as anyone in music history. When asked to reflect on what actually matters most, McCartney points not to an award or an achievement, but to a repaired friendship, one that, given how Lennon's life ended, could very easily have been left permanently broken instead. To bring this full circle, it's worth noting that even decades into his career, McCartney is still human on stage in ways that echo, in a much gentler form, that original Frozen solo all those years ago. During his modern arena tours, he's occasionally stopped mid-song during stadium performances of Hey Jude, after simply blanking on his own lyrics, a song he's performed thousands of times, in front of audiences of tens of thousands of people. Except this time, instead of freezing in embarrassed panic the way he did as a young Beatle, he's turned those modern slip-ups into something communal, a laughing moment shared with the crowd, who happily pick up the singing themselves until he finds his place again. That contrast says a lot. The same basic situations, forgetting what comes next in front of a huge audience, that once nearly convinced him to quit performing altogether, is now something he can laugh through with total ease, because decades of experience, and decades of surviving worse moments, have completely changed his relationship to failure on stage. A frozen guitar solo that almost ended his career before it began, a hidden thread of guilt tucked inside one of the most famous songs ever written, a friendship broken and then quietly repaired before it was too late. Even one of the most celebrated musicians in history has carried real fear, real regret, and real vulnerability through every stage of his career, and he's just gotten remarkably good at turning it into something the rest of us can connect with. If you want to hear McCartney reflect further on his childhood, his parents, and his lifelong friendships, check out his 2026 album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane, Year 19 Hain. It's full of exactly this kind of emotional honesty. And if this story resonated with you, hit subscribe, because I'm covering more of these deep dives into the real stories behind music's biggest names every week. See you in the next one.